Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
With global conflicts, economic uncertainty, a trade war with our biggest ally, and major political shifts in our country, we're at a point where news and the facts matter a lot. However, engagement with traditional media sources such as radio, TV, print, and news websites continues to fall. The future of journalism is facing some transformational challenges. There are attacks and lawsuits from politicians and critics attempting to erode trust in what they call the mainstream media. Many people are instead looking to social media and influencers to get their information. And there's a technological shift where artificial intelligence is being used to scrape information and divert people away from traditional news outlets. So, how dire is the situation facing news media these days? And how should companies, newsrooms, and reporters address the rapidly changing roadblocks in front of them? I'm Cormac McSweeney, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with legendary Canadian journalist and broadcaster Peter Mansbridge, now host of the daily podcast The Bridge, which explores various trends in politics and journalism. Mr. Mansbridge, it's an honor. Thank you very much for joining me to speak about these important issues.
Well, it's a treat for me to talk to you, Cormac. Looking forward to it.
So before diving, I guess, into more specific issues, I'm interested to get a baseline from you. In your eyes, what is the state of journalism right now, and how do you see it evolving over the coming years?
I think we're at a hinge point here in terms of journalism. There's no question that there's a trust issue. The public is concerned about the way it gets information and where it's coming from and how it's being delivered to them. And so this is a moment where journalists and media organizations have to think through this issue of trust with the public. I mean, all kind of national institutions, whether they be journalism or politicians or, you name it, they're all facing a trust problem of a degree. And when you look at the annual stats on what professions are trusted by the public, all the numbers are down, with some exceptions. Doctors, nurses, firefighters, they stay relatively high. A lot of other professions have dropped considerably. Politicians, journalists, when I came into the business in the kind of 60s and 70s, journalists were up there pretty good, in the kind of mid to high 70s, percentage-wise, in terms of those who trusted them. That figure's down, at best around 50, sometimes lower than that, depending on who's taking the data. That's not a good place to be. If journalism is a pillar of democracy, then if you got less than half of people believe in you, we got a problem. Politicians are even further down the list, but that's no benefit to journalists now. They have to recognize the fact that we've got work to do. So there's, why is it happening? There's any number of different reasons to that. I think most people who go to a source of information are looking for the facts, just the facts. They're not looking for that journalist's take on the issue. They're not looking for opinion. But when you scan the kind of airwaves and the digital stuff online, what you get a lot of is opinion, much more than you used to. And I think that's part of the issue here.
To keep on the trust factor, I mean, the 2025 digital news report from Reuters, to your point, found that the overall trust in news was about 40%, which is a drop of 4 points since the pandemic. Do you think that the journalism industry and journalists in general can come back from that?
I think they can, but first they got to recognize that they have a problem. And, what our business is like. Two journalists get very defensive whenever you say, you guys got to think through what you're doing and how you're doing it. People don't believe you. Journalists get defensive about that. and say, oh, they're not reading closely enough or we're not explaining it enough. Well, perhaps there's some merit to that argument. But I think the main argument is that most people look at journalism, whether they come from a certain take or not. We live in polarized times. But let's assume you're neutral body of the public who are just looking for information. Most feel they're not getting it the way, they used to get it, or the way their parents got it, or the way their parents believed in it. They're not getting it that way anymore because what they're looking at is opinion. I'm a big user and believer in news aggregators. I mean, National News Watch, I'm involved with them. So I use a news aggregator, which compiles all the so-called news of the day, and I use that in quotes. When you go through even just their homepage, 75% of what's there is opinion. It's not just the facts. And that's the challenge. I mean, when I got into the business, newspapers were a big deal. And, the editorial page and the op-ed page were basically it for opinion in a newspaper. The rest was all news, daily news. Well, now you have trouble, A, finding a newspaper. And B, when you get to it, it's chock full of opinion. Now, there are a lot of people who love opinion, especially if it's their opinion, if it agrees with what they're thinking. But I think the issue here comes down to what to believe when you're looking at your media source, whether it's online or television or radio or what's left of print. And that's what we've got to get at. I mean, I try to argue that one of the ways of going about it, doing it better on the trust front is by being more transparent in terms of what we put out there and how we put it out. Like a television newscast, do they explain often enough why certain things lead the news? Other things are further down the lineup. Some things don't even make it into the lineup. Do they properly explain why, we're going to spend 5 minutes on this lead story tonight, and here's why? No, they just sort of give you the 5-minute story. When we get around to elections and the constant reporting on polls, do we properly explain how polls are done? Who pays for them? What the margin of error is? How many people were talked to? And when you start rolling all polls together, is that appropriate? Is that right? They're done differently. The data on each poll is accumulated in different ways. Some polls have 1,000 people talked to, others have 2,500 talked to. What's the difference between those? Can you put them together and add them together and say this is, what the polls are telling us? I think if you're going to do any of those things, you've got to explain what you're doing. And I don't think many of us do that enough. I mean, I'm guilty on this opinion thing. I spent 50 years, as you know, as a journalist for the CBC, 20 as a reporter and 30 as an anchor. And that whole time, that whole half century was based on me protecting my position as a journalist without an opinion. I was just there to tell you what happened, everything I could about what happened, the facts, the context, checking things out, verifying things, putting it all out there so you could decide for yourself what to think. Now, I retired in 2017. I do a podcast now. I have fun with it, but it's laced with opinion, often. It's not a newscast. It's a podcast. And our world is consumed by podcasts now, as you know. And people got to understand what they're tapping into. And if they're looking for straight up the facts, then they've got to find the conventional news program that they believe and they trust. And that's one way of getting at.
On the trust issue as well, you mentioned politicians taking aim at the media, and it's not new, but it seems to be hitting new heights. President Donald Trump taking his aggressive approach to journalism to a different level. Recently with Paramount, which owns CBS, settling a lawsuit with Trump for $16 million over the show 60 Minutes over edits that they had made to an interview with then Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris. He also settled a lawsuit with Disney. I think there might be one with Fox. So there's a lot there. Is there a fear that political pressure that seems to be increasing on journalists will have a chilling effect on newsrooms if there's a larger fear and constant fear of litigation?
There's definitely that fear, and it's definitely happening in the United States. We used to laugh at Trump's continuous threats of lawsuits, many against journalists, because many of them didn't pan out. They didn't go anywhere. They either lost in the courts or they never even got to the courts. These lately have been, especially since, the Trump kind of owns the courts now in terms of his appointees on the Supreme Court and at different other levels. So is it a fear? Absolutely, it's a fear. But, as soon as a story comes out that he doesn't like, bang, launches a lawsuit. He did it with the Wall Street Journal just in the last, week or two. Over the issue of the Epstein files. Now, many people look at these lawsuits as he's just trying to, protect himself against potential stories coming out. He's trying to, move that ball away from the main story to a different kind of story. So everybody's focus is on something different. But look, it's a real issue. And we've seen in Canada at times, in the last few years, a kind of approach that Trump used with journalists in his first term, especially so in his first term, where he'd just basically dump on journalists, good journalists, who ask good questions. And he'd either try to make fun of them or denigrate them, and we've seen and it appeared to be working. Now, we saw the same thing try to happen here in Canada. We saw Pierre Poilievre do that at times during the moments where he was 25 points up in the polls. And it seemed to be a popular approach to take. Crap on the media. Go after the storyteller. But I don't think it did work. And you've seen him back off on that. So it's shown a difference. And, vive la différence. We love the differences between the way we operate and the Americans operate. But there's a chill in the United States. There's no doubt about it. It seems the people who are taking on the president more than anyone else. The reporter, listen, there's a lot of good journalists in the U.S. and some of them are my friends. So I don't want to make it sound like they're all, bending over and letting him abuse their abilities as journalists, because they're not. There are a lot of good journalists, but there's also a chill out there. Fear of the next lawsuit, fear of the next ability of a news organization owner to change the habits of a place, to fire people. And that fear is real. And we've seen things happen. But the area where it hasn't happened, interesting enough, is in the arts. You see, especially comedians, they're not shying away at all from going after Trump, even when they seemingly get fired as a result of it, like Stephen Colbert, and threats that others are about to get the same fate as Colbert did. But they're taking their role as the sort of, comedians of late night pretty seriously, and they haven't stopped going after Trump. Neither have, some actors and singers. Now, there have been a few actors and singers who have supported Trump and join him in attacking the so-called fake news. But it's a difficult time in the States. At the moment, I don't see it here. There's always a constant criticism in this country of at times at a certain level of journalism, especially so the CBC.
I was just going to say the constant calls to defund the CBC.
Right. Well, they come from a certain area, right? I mean, I think we saw in the last election, if that was a real issue, it didn't play for those who were making that argument. And, I've had some conservatives from Western Canada tell me, I can't campaign in my riding on CBC stuff. They don't want to see those signs. Some in rural areas that depend on elements of the CBC, but also some in urban centers as well. So, I mean, there is support for a national public broadcaster. Is there blanket support for the CBC? I don't think so. CBC also has things to answer for in the way it's conducted its own business. Not in terms of bias. I just don't buy into that because I've seen it from the top levels of the place. But there have been issues about CBC management. We all heard the stuff about the bonus payments and all that, which looked and was a terrible thing. But this issue of the future of public broadcasting in Canada is much bigger than concerns about that kind of thing. It's about whether public broadcasting is needed, and if it is the current CBC doing it in such a way that's beneficial to the people of Canada? That is a legitimate debate and discussion and should be had. And, hopefully the new administration, the new CBC administration, new president, will be looking at it that way as well.
We'll have more on the big story with iconic news broadcaster Peter Mansbridge in just a moment. Want to shift the discussion now to the technological challenges facing the industry, at a time when news media is desperate to drive listeners, viewers, and readers to original reporting and content. We have companies like Google who are using artificial intelligence to scrape the web for that content and summarize it in things like an AI overview. And that's essentially preventing people from heading to the original source, and it then deprives news outlets from engagements and ad revenue that we need to survive. Do you think government should be taking more action to try and crack down on this for the survival of the industry?
It's a great question, and it's, aside from the trust issue, it's the biggest challenge facing media organizations right now, is how to protect its, intellectual property, its journalism, from those who want to basically just steal it, grab it, and use it for nothing to benefit them. So we see that happening in the examples you said. In some ways, it happens with news aggregators like National News Watch. But the way it's done in things like that, where they replay the Globe or the Toronto Star or the Calgary Herald or what have you, actually, in the long run, I think benefits those organizations because people click on their links and go to them. But the issues you're talking about are much different. It's basically it's highway robbery. It's grabbing that article, AI, and mixing it into the AI feed. So if I'm sitting at home and I say, tell me everything about Cormac McSweeney, then everything that's going to pop up there on AI is coming from somewhere else. There isn't some guy at AI typing all this stuff out. They've gone from wherever they can find it, put it all together, rolled it out, thrown it to you, and all the organizations that did the actual hard work have done nothing. So your question is, should government interfere? More than in some ways that it already has, and like the Online News Act. I get really antsy when you talk about involving government in any fashion with journalism. We need that arm's length or more than arm's length distance. However, something has to happen here or there will be no more independent news organizations. They got to make a buck. You want good journalism, you got to pay for it. You got to be prepared to pay for it. That's why there are paywalls, as frustrating as they can be for all of us. But we all used to, people my age used to pay for home delivery. And it wasn't free. They didn't sort of come around and drop paper off on your door for nothing. You paid for it. And not only that, you gave the newspaper girl or boy, a tip every week. So it used to cost money. And it still should cost money because there are real jobs there in a dwindling market for journalists. I live in a small town in Canada. I live in Stratford, Ontario. It's like 32,000 people. And we've had a couple of great newspapers over the years, but it's dwindled down to almost nothing. It's full of ads. There's some local journalism, but very little. They don't staff things like the town council meetings anymore, or rarely do. And I've even had town officials come to me and say, this is not good. We're not being challenged. We're not being asked questions on a weekly basis about why'd you do this? Challenging our assumptions on certain decisions that council has made. That makes for good community organization and good local politics and good local journalism. But in many cases, not happening now. And this is all an end product of getting away or trying to get stuff for nothing. And what you bring up is the ultimate of what's happening. And it's about to happen on a huge scale. And it's not just news, it's sports, it's everything. That AI machine is gobbling up everything.
I don't mean to cut you off, but Google does pay in to that fund for the Online News Act. However, we have companies like Facebook who decided we're not going to put any money into it, and we're just not going to air any more content from Canadian news outlets. So it seems to be an interesting thing where the act was supposed to try and help the industry, but in some ways there is money coming in other ways it's drying up potential clicks that could help with ad revenue for those companies. So what are your thoughts on the Online News Act? Do you think it should remain in place, or should Mark Carney, as Prime Minister, do what he did with the digital services tax and scrap it to allow a more free market?
As I said, it's a challenging question. And part of the reason the question is so challenging is that times have changed dramatically, even since the Online News Act came in. We're dealing with a different culture out there. We're dealing with different circumstances, and we're dealing with AI, which was still basically a dream when the Online News Act came out. You're right to mention that Google does pay into this pot, and good for them that they do. I think what governments need to do and news organizations need to do is they need to sit down and see, where are we right now on this issue? Where are we heading? What's it going to look like a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Because whatever we land on now has got to last more than a couple of months. I mean, things are changing so fast. I used to say that our business has changed so fast because of technology, which it had. I mean, when I started in the 60s in television, we were still broadcasting the CBC in black and white, and it was still film. And so, you'd go out on a story, you'd shoot your film, you'd come back, it would have to go to a lab, you'd have to wait for an hour and a half for it to come back. And then when it came back, you'd physically cut the film and stick pieces together to make your item. It's very different now, as we all know. I mean, basically it's live now, or very close to live, depending on what you've been shooting and where you've been shooting in different parts of the world. But you can broadcast from anywhere. The number of stations dramatically changed as a result of, cable first, and then the 500 channel universe, and then the internet, and, you name it, it's just piled on top of each other. And the collapse of, conventional television. the move towards digital on every front. That's all happened in the way the industry has changed. Now the industry is changing because of outside forces that are basically have the ability to capture the content. Because everything's about content now, no matter where you are in the kind of broadcasting orbit. Everything's about content. So how you get that content, and if you can get it for free, just think of the money you can make. So that's where we are right now, and bigger minds than mine are going to have to sort this one out, and where government's role in it is difficult. We've seen what's happened when the parties out of power see a government putting money into journalism in whatever form it may be, they immediately attack it as trying to basically own that journalistic sphere. It's not true. It's not what happens. It's not what happens at CBC. It's not what happens at the National Post or the Globe and Mail. Journalism is journalism. They're trying to do the best job they can with the facts that they are able to uncover and describe. But opposition parties will immediately leap on that, just like the Liberals would if the Conservatives were in power. I mean, I've seen this movie from many different angles over my years. But we are in a very difficult situation right now that needs addressing, and needs addressing smartly by all parties here. And I don't mean political parties. I mean just all parties that are involved in this pie of making journalism, because the public needs it. The public needs good, honest journalism, whether it's in news form, opinion form, documentary form. They need it to better understand the kind of world we live in.
And the consumption of that information, as you mentioned off the top, more and more Canadians are turning to, social media or influencers to try and get info rather than those traditional news sources. So how should newsrooms be adapting their approach to news to try and, I guess, change the way in which the population consumes news, or change the way we present it to the population given their changing desires for where they get that info?
Well, what they should not do is copy the influencers. They should stay steady on what their original focus was. We tell the news. We tell you what's happened in a certain day, as best we can, why it happened, what impact it has, what the facts are surrounding it, and what to believe or not to believe in terms of the story that we're shaping for you, in terms of the facts we have gathered. But the end product is not to tell you what to think. It's to give you the tools to think for yourself. You're not old enough, Cormac, but back in the 80s, we changed the schedule of the CBC in terms of news and information. 1982, we started the Journal with Barbara Frum. We had the National with Knowlton Nash for the first roughly 20, 25 minutes. And then the Journal came on with Barbara Frum. The National was just the news. I was a reporter for that. I was in Ottawa, like where you spend most of your time, covering Parliament Hill. So we'd tell the story as best we could with the facts we had. And then the Journal would come on, and they would do panel discussions, opinion, documentaries. Sometimes it had a slant, took an angle to whatever the story was. But we protected the front half and allowed the second half to basically explore. And in some ways, that's kind of like the old newspaper style. And in some cases, still the newspaper style, is that the news is there up front, and you've got to go inside to find opinion that may or may not influence you. I find it harder and harder to make those distinctions now. And I'm not just talking about Canadian news. I watch I spend almost half the year in the UK. So I watch a lot of UK news. I watch a lot of American news. I watch a lot of Canadian news. And I find like in the US and in the UK at night, you can only find opinion unless there's some big, huge, rolling, breaking story, an earthquake, a flood, a war, what have you. But the rest of the time, it's all opinion. They call it a news channel, whether it's CNN or MSNBC or Fox. It's not a news channel. It's an opinion channel at night in prime time when the bulk of the audience is actually watching. We haven't gone that far in Canada yet, or the temptation is always there, because opinion, clearly in the States, clearly at Fox, makes money, and a lot of it. And we have opinion here on Sirius XM. That's all part of the package. You want an opinion show, there's lots of them. But they're also news programming and thoughtful discussion. And hopefully some will be convinced that even this is thoughtful discussion.
That's what we're trying to bring with this podcast too. Listen to news radio stations for your news 3, 4, 5 times a day, and then head to the podcast for more in-depth conversations and more opinions from excellent guests like yourself.
Well, that's what we try.
we try anyway. Peter, I know we're strapped for time here, so I want to thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your thoughts with us here on The Big Story. Thank you so much.
It's been a treat, Cormac. Take care.
That was legendary Canadian journalist and broadcaster Peter Mansbridge speaking with me about the challenges facing journalism and what the future holds for the industry. I'm Cormac McSweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.